I now want to look at accurately measuring the deviation between a NURBS surface and a mesh. And there are a number of ways of doing this, so I'll start by looking at the control panel and the Show Deviations tool here. And this works between a surface and either a mesh or a curve. So I'll pick the surface and the mesh, and if I click on the tool, I simply get a display of the maximum and minimum deviations across the surface. And we can change the way the deviation is displayed over here in the control panel, under the deviation section. So for example, we can change the precision, which is the number of decimal places that are shown on the min-max locators. But it's generally more useful if we get information across the whole surface. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. And one is to use the deviation map on the evaluation palette. Now this works between a surface and a mesh. So if I click the surface first and say Accept, and then choose the mesh and say Go. And that will give me a colour map showing the deviation according to this scale on the right. And if I double click on the deviation map tool, I can modify that scale to pick up the level of detail that I want. And then the acceptable distance defines the green area, so that when the whole surface is green, I know that I'm within, say, 1 millimetre of the mesh. Use bands stops the graduated shading, and absolute values doesn't distinguish between the positive and the negative deviations. And this is all interactive. So if I now pick some CVs and modify them, and I'll use the Transform CV tool with NUV Normal, and adjust that. And my scaling's a bit too quick, so I'll undo that and just put my mouse sensitivity up higher. Then it momentarily goes green, and then recalculates and shows me that I've improved it around here where I've moved the CVs. So it's a nice visual way of seeing what's happening between a surface and a mesh. Another way is to use cross-sections. So if I pick the mesh and apply some cross-sections, and let's go in the X direction, and I'll put the same sections onto the surface as well. And now I can check between a particular cross-section if I go onto my locators palette. And here on the deviation measures I've got curve-to-curve deviation. So I can pick a cross-section from the surface and the other one on the mesh. And I'll do it again on another set. And I get a readout of the minimum and maximum deviations. And over here on the control panel, I can control the scaling, which shows the deviation cone. And I can type in a bigger number than 10 if I want to see that exaggerated. So the curve-to-curve deviation is a locator measure. So if I want to get rid of those, I just say delete locators. And we can also measure deviation to imported sections. So I'll just create some sections from this mesh using Promote. And I'll make the mesh itself invisible. So this would be a typical set of section data. So I'm just going to ungroup those so that I can select just the ones I want to compare. And then I'm going to use the Show Deviations tool again to give me a whole set of readings across the whole of that surface at each section location. And here I can adjust the display again. So I can turn off the minimum values to simplify the display, and I can cut down the number of decimal places again, just to keep the view uncluttered. And I've got these thresholds, so for example, if there's a glitch that I know about, I can filter out large deviations. And I could also set the minimum threshold to being the tolerance that I need to fit to. And again, it works interactively, so if I just come up here where I've got the biggest deviations, I can modify that with a Move CV and just start to reduce the deviations. So by combining the deviation measures and the cross-sections, you've got a fairly comprehensive set of tools to make sure your surfaces match the scan data within the tolerance you require.